Good evening and welcome. I am Terry Cave, the Jewish Grandparents Network. Thank you for joining us tonight for an important conversation, navigating the anti-Semitism conversation with tween and teen grandchildren. First, may I thank the Jewish Grandparents Network, and I would deeply grateful to Alvin and Lois Lapidus for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. We're so grateful to you all that you made time to join us. Thank you for being here. I also want to thank my colleague Sarah Reed, who is helping facilitate. And Sarah has shared with us in chat how to turn on captions for those who wish to use that feature. We are recording tonight's session, and we will send it to all of you tomorrow and to everybody else who couldn't make it tonight. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome our friends from ADL Education. Michelle Magner is the Director of Content and Learning Design, and she oversees the development and evaluation of resources and programs on anti-Semitism education, school climate improvement, and advocacy efforts for K through 12 schools. Michelle has a bachelor's in education from the University of Dayton and a master's in educational leadership from Ashland University. Before joining ADL, Michelle worked in public schools for 8 years as a high school English teacher and administrator. Over to you, Michelle, with all our thanks for facilitating tonight.
Thank you so much, Terry, for the warm welcome, and want to just reiterate my appreciation to the Jewish Grandparents Network for asking us to join for this really important conversation tonight. I am going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. And we're going to start with also doing a quick poll. But before we get to that poll, let my screen load. Great. Just want to start us with an overview of what we're going to be doing tonight. So the purpose of this time tonight is for us to talk about ways in which we can navigate a conversation about anti-Semitism with grandchildren. Through this webinar, we hope that you will walk away with a couple of new skills. You'll learn a little bit about trends in anti-Semitism that we're seeing today, the impacts that has on young people. We'll talk about how grandparents can support young people navigating anti-Semitism, and we'll learn and hopefully also apply some strategies for talking with young people about anti-Semitism. Just as a reminder, please feel free to put questions into the chat. We'll be looking there throughout the evening, and to please try to keep your microphone off for our recording purposes to make sure it's a smooth experience for all of our participants. So I want to start by doing a quick poll, and I'm going to pop that up in just a second here. You'll see it on your screen, just to get a little bit of an idea of everyone's experiences in the room. So the poll should pop up on your screen in just a second. Okay, hopefully you can see it. And the question that I have for you to start us off with is to choose the response that best reflects your experience with this topic. Talking with your grandchildren about anti-Semitism. So maybe you have talked to them before, you haven't because you don't quite know where to start. You have, but you're not quite sure how it went. You did, and you thought it went really well. You're not sure if you want to, or if there isn't a response that really reflects your experience, feel free to click that other, and you're welcome to pop into the chat in a moment here when we discuss our poll results and tell us a little bit more. All right. 82% participation, pretty good. I'll give another second here before I end the poll. Oh, we've ended our poll. All right, let me share those results so you can all see. So in terms of what people are saying in the room, about 7% of us have talked to their grandchildren before. About 38% say they haven't because they just don't know where to start. 11% say yes, but not quite sure if it went well. 5%, I love the confidence of those folks, say yes, I did it, and I think it went really well. We have about 9% of our audience that's not sure if they actually want to have the conversation. And about 30% of us say, none of these responses really reflect my experience. Feel free, like I said, to pop into the chat if you'd like. Tell us about maybe what your experience has been with talking with your grandchildren. Feel free. Oh, we have a chat response, so I just want to check that really quick. Oh, we have some younger grandchildren. Yep, totally understand. And I have another person who's reached out saying their grandchildren are a little bit young for the conversation. We'll talk about that a little bit further on. If your grandchildren are younger than the teen or tween, we can talk about some strategies. But first, I want to start with talking a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of anti-Semitism, and in particular about anti-Semitism in the K-12 setting. So as you may know, ADL does an audit on anti-Semitic incidents every year. We started doing this audit in 1979. Unfortunately, 2024 was the worst year for anti-Semitic incidents since we began recording these incidents over 4 decades ago. There were roughly 9,354 anti-Semitic incidents across the United States. This is a 5% increase from the previous year. In terms of anti-Semitic incidents in K-12 schools, and non-Jewish K-12 schools, I should say, it did decrease a bit in 2024, about a 26% decrease. That is a great thing, right? But unfortunately, we still saw a reported total of 860 incidents, which is quite significant. 52% of those incidents included a swastika, and 9% of all anti-Semitic incidents were actually happened in the K-12 school setting. One thing I want to emphasize here is that this is based on what is reported and verified. So it's very possible and unfortunately likely that this number is a little bit higher. And in fact, as I said before, still represents a significant amount of anti-Semitic incidents. I also have a graph here that you can see the past 3 years, 2022, 2023, and 2024. You can see how those incidents have ranged. 2022, 495. We saw a gigantic increase in 2023, well over 1,000 incidents, and then 2024, 860. You might be asking yourself, wait, isn't it 2026? Where is the 2025 data? That will be coming out this spring. So you can expect in the next couple of months, ADL will be releasing our incident data for 2025. Just want to pop open the chat because I see I have a number of things happening there. Want to make sure I'm not missing anything. So thank you for participating in the chat. Some more conversations about our grandchildren and where we've started. Some folks sharing about some experiences that they had with anti-Semitism at a very young age. A question about a non-Jewish school. Yes, that means not a Jewish day school. Thank you for that question. And then we have a comment around a parent not being super supportive or being maybe concerned about the grandparent talking with the grandchildren. So we will talk about that later on. So I want to assure you, for the person that put that comment in, we'll talk about that a little bit further on in the presentation. And so, as I said, I think it's important. I don't want us to get too bogged down in the data because it can feel overwhelming. It can feel a little bit daunting. But I thought a good thing for us to sort of ground ourselves in what we're sort of seeing in K-12 schools right now. In terms of incidents, we're seeing sort of interpersonal related situations. So, name calling, identity-based bullying. And then we're also seeing things related to content. So that could be content that is perhaps brought in by an educator. Oftentimes, that is not necessarily with bad intentions. We see that, unfortunately, relatively often. And that could also be something that a peer perhaps is bringing into the school. Regardless of how these things are happening, how they're coming into the school, they have a devastating impact on our young people. And so I have a little screen grab here of an article that talks about a survey that was put out by JFNA last year, actually a year ago this week, about the impacts of anti-Semitism on young people. This survey had 2,500 Jewish teens participate. And what we learned from that is that stress related to the war in Israel and Gaza is the second highest concern of young people, second only to academic pressure. And so we know whether or not our young people are telling us about this, whether or not they're experiencing something directly in school, the impacts reverberate around the community. And so we know that our young people are concerned about this topic, and it's impacting them certainly in a lot of different ways. Okay. Just popping into the chat. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Terry, feel free to interrupt me if there is a question I should respond to.
Will do, absolutely.
Great. So let's shift a little bit to talking about, thinking about our young people and the role in which grandparents can play when it comes to supporting our young people. We know that our young people have been exposed to more than ever before, right? They are online, they're experiencing their lives both in person as well as digitally. And it can be really confusing when something that they are, hopefully really proud of, their Jewish identity, is put into question. So, what can we do as grandparents to navigate this really tough situation? So, the first thing to think about when it comes to the grandparent role, we're not the teacher. We're not a parent and we're not a peer, right? But there's a really, really important role that grandparents can play. They can offer perspective and family history, can be really, really grounding for young people to hear about family history, successes, trials, triumphs through the voice and lens of grandparents and family members. Grandparents can also do a lot to support and really nurture the Jewish identity and values for our young people. And it's really, really, really critical that we take that partnership approach with the adult children involved. So we had a comment in the chat earlier, about maybe a little bit of a different perspective, right? The adult children may say, nope, I don't want you to talk about this. And the grandparent feeling like, oh, this is really, really important. So it's really critical that we have those conversations as adults away from the young people in our lives and come to some sort of understanding for how can we broach this topic in a way that is meaningful, is supportive, and most importantly, I would say, everyone is on the same page. So that doesn't necessarily need to look like, come over to my house. We're going to talk about anti-Semitism on, Tuesday night at 8 p.m., right? I think it's really important that we think about this conversation as not a one and done. You're not going to just talk about it one time and then anti-Semitism solved. We never have to talk about it again. This is something that you're going to have to build on. And it will take many, many conversations. Another thing that was brought up in the chat is the age of our young people, right? And so the way we talk about this with, a 5 or 6-year-old is very, very different than the way we're going to talk about it with a 13, 14, 15, and on-year-old. When I talk to my own children about bias, bullying, anti-Semitism, racism, and hate, my children are 5 and 3. There are ways to have that conversation at a developmentally appropriate way. But of course, the most important thing to think about when you are not the parent of that child is to be ensuring that you are in line with the parent of that child. So, what are some things that we should keep in mind? Really, really important that we validate our young people's feelings. If someone says, oh, I feel embarrassed or ashamed to be Jewish when anti-Semitism happens, we might have a gut reaction to say, oh my gosh, you should never feel ashamed of yourself. You need to be proud. And it's understandable why we might feel that way, but that can really shut down the young people in our lives. So really important to validate those feelings. I hear you telling me that you're feeling embarrassed and upset. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Listen with curiosity, lead with questions. Allow them the space to talk and really work on the listening. Also, share when appropriate. It can be really, really helpful to hear about an experience that other people have had, right? If your grandchild says, "Oh my gosh, this horrible thing happened to me in school today," there was a swastika on the bathroom wall. I wouldn't jump into, "Oh my gosh, there were swastikas in the bathroom wall every day at my school," and launching into that story, right? Let's first hear about their experience before we start bringing into our own experience. So, with those things in mind, don't minimize the situation. Something that's very hard for me, don't jump to solve. I know, especially when people in our lives that we care about are having issues or challenges, we really, really, really want to support them by coming up with solutions. But it's really best to let them lead with the solutions as opposed to you providing those solutions first. And then lastly, try not to center it in fear. We want to make sure our young people feel safe. And so whenever we have these conversations about anti-Semitism, difficult topics, right, we want to make sure we're leading them in and leading them out. And so we don't stop with, well, there's nothing that we can do, right? We need to come up with some sort of solution that is a child-based level, a child level action that they can take. Terry, I see you unmuted, so I'm wondering if there's something in
Yeah,
the chat.
wow, that's perceptive. Ellen asked a question. If you wouldn't mind stopping sharing for one moment so that we can see your face, just so that I
Absolutely.
can ask Ellen's question, which is, could you please give us some examples of how we can actually broach the subject if the kids don't raise it with different age groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think with the first thing, again, going back to making sure that we're in line with the adult children. So we're coming up with a plan together. We're making sure that we are aligned with how to do that, making sure we establish some boundaries about what are the topics that we are wanting to discuss, what are the things that perhaps they're not ready to discuss. When it comes to our youngest kiddos, I think the best way to start these conversations is with validating that foundation of appreciating Jewish identity. So, learning about Jewish identity, really developing that healthy foundation of appreciation and understanding. And then you could use books. Books are really helpful tools to talk about, some difficult situations. There are children's books available out there that talk about anti-Semitism, that talk about hate broadly, that can be helpful. And when I think about things that I talked with my young kids about, my daughter is in kindergarten, and she learned, recently about Martin Luther King. And she was very confused about this. Why don't people like him? And so we keep it very simple. I had a conversation with her, some people don't like people because of the way that they look. And we had that conversation at a child level, as opposed to talking about, the more perhaps adult conversation that could happen with that. So that's a way that we can do that with our younger kids. I think it really helps to center with their experience. So you can ask them, have you heard the word for maybe our, tween age kids? Have you heard the word anti-Semitism before? Do you know what it means? And ask them that question. It could be just starting with their knowledge first and then building from there is a really, really important place to start. I see so many chat things coming in, so I want to make sure I'm not missing
Yes, so
anything.
Ellen asked a follow-up question. She would really appreciate actual words rather than concepts. So you gave us one example there. Have you heard the word anti-Semitism? What else might you? How else might you start the conversation?
Yeah, I think that you could start it with a conversation around bullying, if that's something that they've heard of before. Do you understand what bullying is? What is bullying? Something like that, to develop, a baseline, and then you can build from there to say, sometimes people bully people for a variety of reasons, the way that they look, the clothes that they wear, the food that they eat, and those things are connected often to identity, things that make us who we are. And that might be a way to start that conversation. I see people wanting books. I'm happy to provide some book follow-up. Terry, I can send you some recommended books that you're welcome to use. I think it's also really important that it's difficult to provide a sentence starter necessarily. I know it, which is what folks want, because you really need to start with what the kids know to begin with. So before you can start having a conversation with them about anti-Semitism, the specifics of these things, we need to know what is their understanding. Have you heard this before? And they may not have. Right? And that's a really important place to start. That's also why books are very helpful. If they haven't experienced that before, books can serve as, a mirror. It can reflect our experiences back to us. It can also be a window. We can see into the experiences of others, right? And so books can be helpful tools if they haven't had an experience with anti-Semitism. That they could learn a little bit about it, and then you can have a conversation from there. You can talk about the book, what happened in the book, how did the kids feel, how did it make them feel when they read that book, is really, really helpful. I'm just looking
Thank
into
you,
the,
Michelle. Yeah, Marilyn, I'm wondering if that responds to your question where you said so far none of your five grandchildren have experienced anti-Semitism. Should you still raise the issue, and if so, at what age, really?
yeah, again, I
7,
think
40.
You know, unfortunately, we know that young people can experience anti-Semitism at a very early age. We know that when it comes to children, they can develop negative attitudes towards difference as early as, preschool age, 3, 4 years old. And so, they might not be able to have the language to say what that is, but they may have experienced that feeling before. So again, that's why we should first start with asking questions about, hey, have you heard of this before? And talking with, again, those adult children about how can I broach this topic? I might say, to my adult children, I'm very concerned about anti-Semitism. I see, things in the news. I read reports about these things happening at a really young age in schools. And I'm wondering if this is something you've talked about with your kids. And I'd love to support you with that. How can I help support you with talking about this with our family? And go from there. I think it's never too early to start having conversations with our family members about how we can support each other with these really difficult topics. That doesn't mean that we should just, launch this conversation with everyone in the room, right? Again, I think important for the adults to come up with a plan separately and determine what that plan should be, identify roles for that conversation, right? And then, figure out how we want to do that. Another thing to think about is, again, you're not going to have a conversation at 12 and then we'll never talk about it again, right? This conversation will evolve as their experiences evolve. So if they're not having experiences right now, wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that. But I'd also say that you might not know. And they also may not know. Something could have happened that maybe like, oh, it didn't make them feel good. They felt a little funny about it, but they might not have the words to say, oh, maybe that was because I'm Jewish, or maybe that was anti-Semitism, right? And so I think that's why it's so important of just having those baseline conversations of, how are you feeling? What's been happening at school? Talking about Jewish identity, what that means, how it makes us feel, so that we have those foundational skills and conversations that have happened, so we can use that as a bridge when we start talking about those more challenging topics.
Michelle, so we as grandparents, we all know to respect our adult children's wishes. So Susan asks, so what if the adult children are not raising our grandchildren in a Jewish home and they don't want to talk about anti-Semitism? Chances are they're going to say no to me.
Yeah.
What do I do with that?
Yeah, I think, I think bringing back to one of the things I said a little bit earlier, that I think the foundation for, this is first a celebration and joy of Jewish identity. And so even if your grandchildren are not being raised Jewish, if you identify as Jewish, you can talk about how your own identity, your feeling, your family traditions, your heritage, and that can be the doorway into that conversation. So you can certainly share about your experiences, right? And again, I think centering those things in the joy, right? The Jewish joy, the celebration of identity. What are the things that you might share? Even if they are not being raised Jewish, there may be some traditions or cultural celebrations perhaps that you still share or you get to share with them, or maybe you'd like to share with them. Maybe you don't do that now, and that could be something that you could, talk to your adult children about, saying, "Hey, I'd love, totally respect that you are raising the children this way. I would love to share this about myself and my identity. What do you think are some ways that we could do that together?"
Michelle, there are a ton more questions, including some really tricky ones, which is the equating, anti-Zionism and equals anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Do you want to continue and get to questions? We've got, our friends sent in many questions in advance. Would you like to take charge again?
Well, I think that some of this will come up again later. And so I suggest we move forward and then we will make sure that we have time for questions. And I'm so happy there are so many questions. So thank you for them. All right, I'm going to pop up my slides. Okay. So, this is where we're going to probably have some conversations. I wanted to talk about some scenarios that could happen with your grandchildren and come up with, what we should do. So I'm going to read the scenario. I'm going to ask you to pop into the chat what you think the best response to this would be. So we have our grandchild sharing that swastikas were found at their school. The grandparent wants to help, but is unsure whether to encourage action, provide comfort, or contact the school. What would the best approach be? A, jump into action, asking a bunch of questions. B, reassuring your grandchild that a symbol can't hurt you. It's not a big deal. It happens a lot. Call your adult child and start asking what they're doing to address this. Or D, ask your grandchild how the incident made them feel. See some responses coming in. Okay, I love the combination response. All of them. Yeah. Thanks for the honesty of I'd probably jump into action. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I would encourage you to not do A, at least not outwardly. Maybe you have those questions rolling through your mind, but I would not start with that with your grandchild. I would probably start with D, asking them how they made them feel, right? Starting with their experience, how are they reacting to it? Their reaction may not be what we expect. Their reaction may make us uncomfortable. That's okay. We need to see what they're doing first. And then, absolutely, I would encourage you to reach out to your adult child and ask, how are they working to address this? How can you help support them with it? And that might be doing some of the A things, but not starting there. All right, our next scenario, our grandchild mentioned seeing anti-Semitic comments on social media. Uh, you may not fully understand this online space that they're in. How can they still offer meaningful support and guidance? So, A, ask them how often it happens. Let your grandchild lead the conversation and consider additional follow-ups based on their responses. B, encourage your adult children to take away their devices or at least start looking at their posts. Online spaces need to be monitored more closely. C, call your adult child and start asking what they are doing to address this. D, tell your grandchild to get offline. In-person interaction is better anyways. Let's see what we got. I see some A's, I see some C's. Very good. All of them I see again. A, depending on answer C, A and C. I love lots of combinations, which is really, really nice. Definitely agree to start with A, asking them some additional questions, allowing them to lead the conversation. And, of course, always encourage reaching out to our adult child, even though, D may be where I want to be. I'd like to be less online. I don't want my children to ever go online. We want to start right with letting them lead the conversation first. All right. A grandparent wants to help their grandchild feel proud of their Jewish identity in the face of rising anti-Semitism. What conversations and activities can bridge generations while building resilience? So we have A, start hosting mandatory Shabbat dinners for everyone, no excuses. B, first reach out to your adult children, see what conversations they're already having at home, run ideas by them first about how to start having these conversations with your grandchildren. C, plan a family trip to a Holocaust museum or center so they can better understand their history. D, start encouraging your grandchild to express their Jewish identity externally, no more hiding. Okay. See a lot of B's. I see C and D. Great. Awesome. Love that. I think having a family tradition like a regular dinner is wonderful, but we should absolutely start with B, reaching out to the adult children to develop that plan. Um, these other ideas of going to a Holocaust museum, of course, could be a wonderful experience, but certainly isn't where I would start. And, if our grandchildren want to express their Jewish identity externally, we should, of course, try to encourage them. But again, starting with B, I think definitely makes the most sense, and seems to be where we are all sort of starting out with. Um, I only have a few more and then we're gonna get to some questions. There's a resource that we have. It's called Antisemitism Today, which is a really helpful tool for having conversations with young people about what is anti-Semitism, how is it manifesting. What I like about our table talks is they provide an overview of a topic that is designed for the adult sort of moderator or facilitator of the conversation. You might not feel like you know all the answers. You might feel like, oh, I don't even know how do I put into words, right, what anti-Semitism is? So this is a place that you can start with that. It gives an overview of anti-Semitic incidents, information about anti-Semitic attitudes, and provides also an overview of how hate and bias can escalate. One thing that's really helpful is it has some questions that you can start the conversation with, as well as suggested action that you can do together after you've had that conversation. I'll pop that into the chat in just a minute, but now I want to stop sharing because now we have a lot of questions, so I want to make sure that we save time for questions. So feel free to pop those in the chat. And then I also know, Terry, that we have questions that were sent in before this evening. So wherever you want to start is fine with me.
I do also want to just tell our guests that tomorrow we will send out all the resources that Michelle has referred to, the table talk, the recording, Michelle's slides. So you'll have all that tomorrow. And sometimes our emails go into spam or junk, so look there. I think it's important, Michelle, that if you could address, please, the question from Roz and Michael. I'm not sure if it's Roz or Michael here. Who phrase it rather well. Anti-Zionism, with its attendant claims of genocide, apartheid, and settler colonialism, is the leading source of anti-Semitism in my city. How do you suggest that we proceed with our grandchildren?
Yeah. An easy question. We'll solve that right now in here. No, all joking aside, I think a really important question and conversation. Certainly, we're seeing anti-Zionism as a leading right sort of motivating factor in a lot of anti-Semitic incidents, right? And so I think that having an understanding of Zionism, of understanding the connection of the Jewish people to Israel, is perhaps a place to start. Thinking about having conversations around those things with our young people, having them understand if maybe they don't understand, right? As a lot of people do not understand the historical significance of Israel, the history of the actual physical land itself is important, as well as the cultural sort of connection that Jewish people have to the land. I think is really important. We have a center on anti-Semitism research that has done a lot of research into this topic, and there are some things that work really well with navigating this conversation, and there are some things that that don't work so well with navigating this conversation. So focusing on the warmth of Jewish people, not comparing different types of atrocities, not comparing different forms of oppression is really important, and focusing on sort of the extreme nature of what anti-Zionism really represents, right? Which is this idea of if Zionism is the belief of Jewish people to have self-determination in their homeland, anti-Zionism is sort of the elimination of that, right? And focusing on the extreme nature of that can be very effective. But again, things like this, the idea of anti-Zionism, or some of these, allegations around Israel, the Israeli people, is not something that is going to be solved in a one conversation situation, and is something that you will have to build on many conversations.
So, to follow up on that, what do we say? What do we say to the kid? The kid, if our grandchild, our tween or teen, says to us, "I, grandma or software, I don't know what to say," so I just walk away. I turn my shoulder. What? How can we guide our kids about what to say?
Yeah,
Grandkids.
I guess the what I would say first is it is a choice to not say something. And I think I would ask them, why do you walk away? Is it because you don't want to engage in the conversation? It's because you do, but you're scared. I would want to know more about that choice before I would, give guidance into what they should do next. Because it is, we can choose to say things. We can also choose when to not. And I think both can be valid decisions, right? I also think that there are, we have these sort of like we call them 6 simple strategies for interrupting bias and hate that can sometimes be useful. So I think it also depends on the situation. Is this someone that we know well? Is this happening in person? Is it a friend? We always try to recommend to folks that they assume good intentions in people. That can be very, 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 very difficult, especially when people are saying things that are deeply harmful to us. But to try to assume the good intention, especially if it's someone that we know, is a helpful place to start. Earlier, I suggested that, we lead with curiosity. I think when people say things that are harmful, that's also a good principle to apply. So if someone says something, what did you mean by that? Is a really small thing to say, a quick little thing we could say, that can be a helpful way to sort of pause a conversation, right? Instead of, if someone says something that is offensive to me, immediately in my mind, oh my gosh, I can't believe they said that. Why would they do that? Oh my gosh, I might be getting really upset. Instead of me doing all of that work, trying to figure out what did they mean, let's put that back on them. What did you mean by that? Allow them the opportunity, right, to explain, because perhaps they aren't sure what they meant by that, right? Especially if we're talking about young people. Oftentimes young people say things that they don't quite know what they mean, or they may even know that it is something that's upsetting. And that's part of why they're saying it. It is normal for young people to push boundaries and limits and sometimes say hurtful things for reactions. That doesn't feel good, right? We don't want, of course, this to happen to our young people. But it is something that, we have to prepare our young people for that could happen. I saw someone ask for the 6 simple strategies. We can absolutely, share that and follow up with Terry.
I'm struck by what Vivian put in chat. Vivian, would you, and in fact, we invite you, or would you like to unmute or raise your hand? And I know Elaine had sent in a question, and I said she'd like to ask it in person. So, Vivian, would you like to unmute and share your observation for us all?
Well, specifically, yes. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Um, Specifically about what that you said. What are you addressing that I had written?
You said conversations like these should incorporate other targeted humans, that thought.
Okay. Yeah, well, I have found that I don't need to go through a whole um, resume of what I've done in terms of this type of work, and it is work, in my opinion. Um, I have a kind of a double-headed whammy here. We're Jewish, and we also have children of color, biological children of color. So, and and they're first cousins to each other in terms. The Jewish experience is certainly different than a black or a brown experience, but they encompass a lot of the same isms that we experience. And we found that we did a big grassroots movement here where I live, inviting people of all, and it's not a very diverse community we live in, but we invited and welcomed people of different people that we normally, under normal circumstances in our daily living, would not really have a chance to be around or be with. And we had it facilitated. It was very structured. But just to find out the core beliefs and the core feelings of what people have in terms and of these issues. And it's interesting if we have 100 people at a group, if we talked and broke the barrier of only one or two of them, that was such progress. So having these people together and interacting, even though they may be some of the people that called my son the N word or the I'm not going to say anything about the Jewish, different things that they can call Jewish folks, or any other race or ethnicity. But we found, and it's hard work to do that because you get some angry people. They would get some people who don't want to change. They don't want to have anything to do with Jewish people or people of color. Without belaboring it, I just found that it can be very frustrating, but it's so unbelievably enriching to see that maybe if you get through to one person, that might snowball. So, I mean, that's what I was talking about when I said that. No, there wasn't much space. I didn't want to go on with a dissertation about that, but I just found that and it's slow, arduous work, and it's disappointing and it's heartbreaking because we're looking at our children. Um, but it's worth it because that's something that is incumbent upon me to do. At least I feel that way, to give them a better life and a better perception of what they have to look forward to because they're going to look forward to this. And I say look forward to it because they can look forward to it with success and joy and enrichment rather than feeling victimized. So that's
Thank
what I
you.
had to say about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, Michelle, would you like to respond? Would
No, I appreciate, you sharing your experience. I don't know that I have a response, honestly, other than appreciation.
Thank you, Vivian. I so appreciate you stepping up to share that. Elaine, you wrote to me earlier and you said you'd like to share your question in person. So if you want to unmute, we'd welcome that.
Unmute.
So while Elaine unmute, oh, here we are. Hello.
We have 6 grandchildren. 2 are teenagers, and the oldest is 16. And she doesn't seem to want to discuss anti-Semitism at all. She will leave the room or say, I'm not interested, or just, how can we engage her in a conversation to get from her some of the things you were saying, to really listen, to understand her feelings when she just seems like I'm not engaging. So how can we still respect the boundary that she has set, but yet have the important conversations about anti-Semitism, especially because she's a year out from college when, my feeling is she really needs to sort of deal with and process her feelings and her emotions.
Yeah, great question. Can I ask you a question back?
Mhm.
I wonder if you could share, have you expressed to her why it is important or why you feel it's important to have that conversation?
Not in so many words, but she knows that uh, anti-Semitism and Jewish identity and feelings about, our Jewish background is so important. So I think she would understand for sure why this would be an important topic, but she just shuts down and isn't seemingly isn't
Yeah.
interested.
Yeah, I might encourage you to express to her why, like really, even though you think she may know, like I would love to talk with you about this because of X.
Mhm.
Would you be interested in having that conversation with me? Or I notice when we have a conversation about anti-Semitism, you seem to shut down. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you're feeling and why that's happening? And go sort of from there. There could be a lot of reasons why she doesn't want to talk about this. And so I would encourage you, like I said, to be vulnerable yourself to say why you feel it's important. You could share something about, the reason why I'd like to talk to you about this is because of maybe an experience perhaps you had, or maybe not, right? Perhaps, that might be a good place to start. I mentioned books. There's a really wonderful book that came out think it was in November of last year, called Don't Feed the Lion. Maybe you have heard of it before. I really, really like this book. It is about an experience of anti-Semitism that happens in a school. And the book tells the story from multiple people's point of view. Several students who are Jewish, a brother and sister, a student that is not Jewish, who is sort of like an ally, and all their experiences with the situation and how they deal with it. One of the students, the Jewish student, does not want to deal with it at all, completely shuts down, kind of describes what you're saying. When his parents bring it up, don't want to talk about it. The younger child in that family is like all in and wants to do everything. And so you get to hear about all those different perspectives. I bring up books again because books are a really great way to start a conversation. You could read a book together as a family. You could just tell them, I just read this book. I think you might like it. I'll put it in the chat. It's Don't Feed the Lion. I'll put the link in the chat in just a minute here. But a really great, it's for middle grades. So like 6, 7, 8, but that doesn't mean that a high schooler wouldn't enjoy it or find it to be meaningful. Books are also really great because now we're not talking about ourselves, right? We're talking about these characters, and that can take us out of it a little bit more. Using, a current event, a book, a podcast you just listened to, things like that can help bridge a conversation. Oh, perfect. Molly put it in the chat. Thank you, Molly. Don't Feed the Lion. I found it to be a really, really engaging book. Really, really recommend it. I also, if it's okay, Terry, I want to go back. There was a question or a comment earlier I saw in the chat that I was like, oh, I want to make sure I say something about this. Where someone put something into the effect of, concerns about reinforcing stereotypes when we talk to young people. So I gave an example of, having a conversation with my child about racism, and saying that, some people didn't like Black people because of the color of their skin. That is a simplistic, obviously does not get into the many layers, right, of racism and how it interacts at both, an interpersonal as well as a systemic sort of level. But keep in mind, we need to start with where our children are. They need very simple explanations. So a 5-year-old explanation is going to look different, right, than an explanation for an older child. So, we can say something like, anti-Semitism means hating Jewish people. This can be, anti-Semitism can be expressed as not liking people, hurting them, making fun of them simply because they are Jewish. This is an example of prejudice. Prejudice is judging or having an idea about someone based on their identity just because of who they are, right? And so I think it's really important that it's really, really important that we start at that base level understanding of where our kids are and build from there. They need that simple understanding. And so I just wanted to go back to that because I can appreciate that reaction of a concern of, being stereotypical. But again, think about we need to ground this conversation and where our kids are, and it will develop as they get older.
That's helpful, Michelle. Raymond put a note in that sometimes writing a letter is another option to open up the conversation. Raymond, if you want to jump on and tell us if you've done that and what that might look like. And I think, I know Raymond has his camera off, so you may not, sorry to put you on the spot. Let me jump into a question that we got earlier in advance. Here it is. I am the grandma to a 15-year-old boy. He has told me that he doesn't like to admit that he is Jewish in public to friends and classmates. I hit the roof and said to him that was not necessary and not the way to go, that he should be proud of his Jewish ancestry. He's actually in a school that has many Jewish students. Can you help me give him more of an answer?
So I think, I can appreciate and I appreciate the honesty of, hitting the roof and having that reaction. But first, I would invite you to think about some of the things we talked a little bit earlier, to ask some questions more, can you tell me why you don't like to share about being Jewish? And it could be something, maybe it is something big, maybe it's something small. Like, I don't know, I just felt like that on that day. You know what I mean? It really depends on what's happening with the child. And I think, sharing things about why you are proud to be Jewish can be helpful. But I think it's first starting with that, asking a question, seeking to
Mm.
understand, tell me a little bit more about that. You mentioned you don't like to talk about being Jewish. Can you tell me more about why? And see where it goes, as opposed to saying, oh my gosh, don't do that. Because at worst, right, maybe they're never going to share something with you again. How vulnerable, for your grandchild to say, I don't actually want to do this. I don't want to express this part of myself. That might have felt scary for them to say. So, saying, thank you for telling me that is also something I really encourage, right? Even when the thing that they're sharing with you isn't something you want to hear, expressing that appreciation for the openness to share it is so, so, so important. Because that will really stick with them. This idea that, oh my gosh, I said something that was maybe a little dicey, that I wouldn't expect my grandparent to be, so understanding of. They will really remember that.
Yeah,
Can I hop in for a
that
second?
that was me, and my grandson, he's kind of an adopted grandson, and I've known his family for years. He was in New Zealand actually for years, and that's where the anti-Semitism happened to him. And I wanted everybody to know that that was my first reaction. I hit the roof. I was in the car with him, and it was. I don't know if we left it in such a good place, but he knew exactly how I felt. That was important. But now I'm going to have to go back and try to scrap my way back into a better conversation with him or his parents or both.
Thank you for being so vulnerable to share that. And it's, life is long, God willing, and we always, look for the opportunity, right, to repair. And again, how powerful it will be, for his parents and for him as well to hear you say, you know what, I regret that reaction. I apologize. This is what was happening for me. I'm so sorry. Could you tell me more? That is so powerful, to have an adult, especially an important adult in your life, say that.
That's a good idea. I think that'll be a way back into the conversation with him.
Yes. Uh, Michelle, the last question I'm going to share that came in advance is another vulnerable and just revealing. It's what we struggle with. How do we grapple with the dilemma that we still want our teen grandchild to be Jewish, to
Mm.
be proud and brave as they are, but also we are afraid for them to be bullied or ostracized from their
Mm.
school and friends?
Yeah. So, I really appreciate that question. And this is a fear, I think many people probably on this call can have.
Yes, hi, that's me. I'm here.
Thank you. I don't know if you wanted to share more from that. I'm happy to.
No, go ahead.
Oh, um, I was just going to suggest that you find spaces like this. You find folks that you can talk about that vulnerable feeling with together. I would, encourage you to not project that too much onto your grandchildren, right? Of course, it could come up within the context of a conversation, but I would encourage you to find people to have that conversation with, whether it's people in the Jewish Grandparents Network, other friends, that might have a similar experience to talk about those fears together. And then think about ways that we can support our grandchildren with the choices that they're making, right? Whether that is to be, outwardly very proud and celebrating their Jewish identity or not, but to have a place to talk about those fears. In the aftermath of, if I could share a little anecdote, in the aftermath of October 7th, um, we got so many calls, at ADL, about things happening in schools, from parents, or not even things happening, concerns that they might happen. And then we got a lot of calls from principals and school administrators saying, parents are calling me every day, concerned that something is going to happen. I don't know how to reassure them. And I think the reality is that when things happen, we have it's very difficult, right? To not, project that sort of internalized trauma that we might feel from past experiences we've had, from historical family trauma that we may carry. But it's really, really important that we try not to, project that right onto our young people in our lives. We had many conversations with teens in the aftermath of October 7th, and they had ranging emotions. There were some kids that were like, I am so afraid. There were other kids like, I'm not that worried about this. They didn't have they were of course sad that it had occurred, but they weren't carrying that stress every day. We found that a lot of adults were carrying that stress and sometimes projecting that onto the young people. And so I say all that to say is that it is, of course, normal for you to have those fears and concerns. But to try to find a support system to have that conversation with, so that we're not bringing that to our grandchildren, and giving them that fear and anxiety. We're, having that conversations with the other adults in our lives.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. We are at 7:56. We have 4 minutes left. Is there anybody who would like to unmute? Just go for it. We'll spotlight you, or you can just speak. Any last questions?
I would like to ask, because I put it in the chat, but Terry didn't ask it yet. When you have grandchildren who have diagnosed anxiety, a lot of it is inherited. We are children, grandchildren, and now grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. It's kind of part of the DNA. How do you approach that type of child? You don't want to give them more nightmares. You don't want to create more anxiety, yet when they're one of the only Jewish children in public school or in their class or whatever, you want them to be aware. How do you handle that?
Yeah, really, really difficult. Thank you, Bonnie, for sharing that. I think, we go back to some of the things I think I talked about earlier, that we, should treat, if we're having a conversation, right, with a young person about anti-Semitism, we treat their questions with respect, and seriousness. We use the most simple language possible. A lot of times when things happen, even if a child doesn't have anxiety, right, they may become very upset. They struggle to understand why these bad things might happen. And so I think it's really important that we don't deny the things that happen. We affirm what has happened, and that we use that simple sort of language. So, with October 7th, on October 7th, terrorists murdered Jewish people simply because they are Jewish. It was very scary. It was very sad. People did die. Simple explanations. We can also highlight the individuals that helped in that situation. The reaction of, communities rising together to support each other, and assuring our children that they are safe here. I think that's really, really important. A bad thing happened. You are currently safe. You are safe, and you are safe with me. And really focusing on that. I talked a little bit about leading them in and out of the conversation. So ensuring that, sometimes our kids, of course, don't allow us for this. They might ask us questions as we're driving to school in the middle of the morning, and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? They just asked me, my daughter asked me the other day, why do humans die as we're walking to school? And I'm like, oh my goodness, how do I start this one, right? And so making sure that we lead them safely in and out of the conversation. You are safe now. Here are things that we can do. What would you like to do to support our Jewish community? Is there something you would like to do together? It could be, something maybe they want to share about their Jewish identity at school. Maybe they would like to start going to, a club if they're not currently participating in something like that. But really thinking about child level actions they can take. It's important for our young people to know that they can use their voice for change. They have have the ability to do things within their own power to make a difference. It can feel hard when we think about big, scary things like, oh my gosh, what could I do about that? But if we think back, what are the interpersonal things? We use a tool sometimes called the spheres of influence. Who are the people in our community that we could reach out to? And that literally you could draw, a circle, and that circle is you. And then, do you play sports? That's another circle. Do you have a job? That's another circle. The neighborhood in which you live, that's another circle. What are steps you could take in each of those circles to bring awareness about anti-Semitism? And it doesn't have to be something, we can start with smaller things, right? Celebrations. That is different than discussing anti-Semitism, but it's an important, I think, component of, we don't want to just talk about Jewish people, especially if we're talking with people that maybe don't know many Jewish people. We don't want to just talk about them through the lens of oppression, right? They should understand the joy of Jewish experience, all those different types of things. So I'm rambling now, Bonnie. But I think, focusing on some of those strategies might be helpful. I see Susan's hand up.
Thank you. Yes, Susan's hands up. Susan, you're going to be the last hurrah goes to you because we are at 8:01. So
thank you.
And then we will sign
Thank
off.
you. This has really been a very interesting experience sharing this, and I know we could go on more and more. I'm doing a lot of work with my congregation about discussing anti-Zionism, is it anti-Semitism? The ADL is known for saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Is the ADL still taking that approach, or has there been some talk about maybe there's room there because, it's anti, I'm anti the Israeli government approach, but I still love Israel.
Yeah, I think if you're anti-Israeli government policies, but you are supportive of the state of Israel, I don't know that I would call that anti-Zionist.
But
And
sometimes
so,
they call themselves anti-Zionist.
yeah, say that again, sorry.
Sometimes they call themselves anti-Zionist because, so the definition you gave us, I'm just asking if the ADL is kind of looking at this again.
Yeah, I think that in conversations about Zionism and anti-Zionism, we always want things to be straightforward, and it is not, right? That there can be gray within that. I think part of that is because I came to this conversation with a definition. There are many other people that have different definitions for anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so I think in having a conversation with someone about that, I would start by saying, tell me, you say you're anti-Zionist. What does that mean to you? And they can share what that means to them. And if they say, I don't like Israeli government policy, I like Israel, wonderful. I wouldn't call that anti-Zionist. And so, we can come to a level of understanding. But I think oftentimes in these conversations, because they are personal and they can feel so charged, they feel very high stakes. Right? I ask us to try to lower that temperature again by being curious to say, tell me more. You call yourself anti-Zionist. That means something to me, but I want to know what it means to you. And then would you be okay with me sharing when I hear someone say they're anti-Zionist, what that brings up for me? And if they're amenable to that conversation, well, now we have a discussion. If they're not amenable to that conversation, well, I don't know that we're changing hearts and minds here. I'm not sure, sometimes I would say we have to go in with the intention of actually having a dialogue, which means not debating, which means listening to the response and responding to what the person is saying and not our assumptions about what those things are.
Thank you, Michelle. We're deeply grateful to you, to Molly, to ADL Education for preparing with us for this event, and to all our grandparent friends who stayed on till we're at 8:04. Thank you so much for joining us. Tomorrow, look for an email from me. It may go into spam, it may go into junk. It'll have the recording and the resources that Michelle shared. We thank you for being here tonight. And we so appreciate your frank engagement, your vulnerability, and for being part of the JGN Mishpocha. To all, good night. Thank you for being here.